Hey, it's Minute Book Reports, and I am reading The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert, and it got me thinking, what is the purpose of fairy tales? And I'd be curious, what do you think the purpose of fairy tales are? I've read chapters 1 through 18, and basically the story is about a girl named Alice, whose grandmother was a very famous fairy tale writer, and she wrote this book called The Tales of Hinterland. And Alice's mother and her, they travel around the country, and one day, Alice's mother is kidnapped, and they think that the people who kidnapped her are these fairy tale people from a place called Hinterland. So they're trying to find basically her mother, and Alice has a friend named Finch, and who Finch is a really big fan of her grandmother. So he knows all the different stories in that collection of fairy tales. And he has this discussion with her about the purpose of fairy tales in his life. And basically what he was talking about was that he always felt like fairy tales it was like a comfort read for him, that he loved to read, but that these stories were not anything, there's no big twist, there's nothing like that. Fairy tales are very real and they're very dark, but they always seem to find this same rhythm, he calls it, where you kind of know what's going to happen, right? The prince will save the princess, or the villain will always fall. He really liked these stories because he even though the stories were formulaic, he found comfort in that. And for him, that was the purpose of fairy tales. And it got me thinking about what the purpose of fairy tales are to me. And I guess for me, the purpose of fairy tales are to tell interesting and compelling stories that hopefully teach us some sort of moral, like a fable. But the thing about fairy tales that I think makes it particularly interesting is that oftentimes they're dark, whereas I think a lot of the fables are not necessarily dark or twisted. But a lot of fairy tales are very dark, and I'm talking about the original fairy tales. So we are very familiar with the fairy tales that are retold by Disney, but those are often cleaned up and polished for general audiences. But if you look at the actual fairy tales way back to Hans Christian Andersen or the Brothers Grimm, they're not that clean. They're actually pretty gory at times, but that's okay because that's how they were told. They were told as children's stories to keep them excited or interested and maybe even scare them in a way. But today, fairy tales are often this magical, oh, don't worry, everything is going to be okay in the end. And for the most part, sometimes they are. But I think when we talk about the purpose of fairy tales, I'm starting to think about that more throughout this story, and I haven't quite gotten an answer yet. So that's why I'm kind of curious what other people think about what the purpose of fairy tales are. But I'm hoping that the rest of this book, basically the latter half of this book, will hopefully get me thinking about what the purpose of fairy tales are in today, in my life. So another thing I want to talk about is writing style in this book. And there seems to be a very distinct writing style from the narrator, who is Alice in this story. And then we get these other moments where it's a different narrator. And what I mean by that is basically the general story is told by Alice, and she is telling it in sort of in her mind as things are happening. She's able to do flashbacks and recall certain memories. But then there are certain chapters where that authorial voice is given to Finch or another character. And in those moments, I find the writing to be very good. So I noticed that there are at least 3 instances so far in the first 18 chapters where that is very apparent to me. And the first one is when we are sort of in this scene where there's Alice and Finch is telling Alice about a particular fairy tale that was written in that collection, because the collection is so hard to find that Alice wasn't ever able to read any of it, but Finch was. And so he recalls the tale. And during that chapter, the writing is so compelling. It's so interesting that I kind of wish the whole book was like that. In fact, I kind of wish I could read all the tales of Hinterland by themselves, and because it's so well written. The stories are so well written that it is incredible. And then we kind of go back to the the main narrator's voice, who is Alice, and it's not as nice. It's not as polished. It's very sort of free and loose and sort of a stream of consciousness type of thing, where she's just kind of thinking and talking at the same time. But when you have the structure of the fairy tale, it's really well written, and I noticed this. And then we also have the sort of excerpt of Ness, who is I think she was a graduate student at the time, and she was basically trying to find the Hazelwood, which is where Alice's grandmother used to live. And so she's trying to find her, and she has this blog post, and the blog post sort of recounts her investigation, her studies, her progress as she's going through this process to try and find the grandmother. And that part was so compelling and well written, and I really liked it. It was so interesting. And then we get back to Alice again, and it's not as well written, I think, or it's not as interesting, and it switches the voices, and it's a little discouraging sometimes. And then lastly, they tell another fairy tale of the door that was there but wasn't there, or something like that, and it basically was this really, really gory fairy tale, but it was so well written, and I liked it. It sometimes is confusing when you have a well-written fairy tale within the story that is kind of chaotic. You know, the narrator's voice is very different, and maybe to some extent that's on purpose, but it really draws me into the story, and I really love reading the parts where it's the fairy tale, or it's Ness, or it's some kind of controlled narrative. But then the rest of the story is this uncontrollable narrative sometimes, where we're going in flashback, sometimes we're in her mind, sometimes we're in the present, and it's a lot to keep track of. And that's one of the things that I noticed in terms of this writing style. And I just kind of wonder if anybody else noticed this too. The last thing I want to touch upon, which really isn't a big deal, but just something that I wanted to comment on, is the fact that a lot of the story is driven from Alice, who is trying to find her mother because the hinterland supposedly took her mom. I guess for me, they've tried to build that relationship between Alice and her mom Ella in the beginning of the story, where basically they're talking about how they would travel across the country together, and it was just the two of them, and they sort of had this sort of Gilmore Girls-ish type of relationship, where it's like this mom and this daughter, and they're buddies, and they're gonna conquer life together. As long as they have each other, they'll be fine. And I completely understand that type of relationship or dynamic. But the thing is, I never really felt that way about Alice. I never felt like she was ever that close with her mom. There are moments where they spend time together, and they're sort of, they're having a mother-daughter moment. But I never felt like they were best buddies. I never felt like there was that super close, super tight bond that they shared. Again, I'm comparing it to something like Gilmore Girls, where you have the mom and the daughter, and they're like best friends. I never really felt that way, because I think a lot of their relationship in the story, Alice and Ella, the daughter and the mom, a lot of that relationship was built on a quick flashback that was being told to us, rather than through the present with current dialogue. And that's something that I hope that we'll see later in the future, but we don't really get that in the first 18 chapters. And so even though the main sort of plot, what's at risk, what is at stake in this story, is the mom being kidnapped and the daughter trying to rescue her, I never felt like they were that close. So as she's trying to rescue her mom, I'm kind of wondering why. Alice's personality doesn't seem to be very warm, and yet we're supposed to believe that she is so close with her mom, and I just felt like she doesn't even get along with her mom, and I think that's a big thing, where for most of this book so far, I felt like her and her mom never really got along. Like, there was a lot of tension between them, because the mom would always be traveling, the mom wouldn't let Alice see the grandmother, and didn't know anything about the father, and so I always felt like there's this weird tension between them. And yet Alice is trying to rescue her, and she's going to risk her life for her. So that was something that kind of, I'm open to being, understanding this relationship between them. And maybe we'll get that once they become reunited in, I assume, the hinterland, when eventually Alice will travel to Hazelwood and find it and then see her mom. But in the beginning of the story, I don't really feel that connection. And maybe I missed it. I'm not really sure. But just based on Alice's personality, it just doesn't seem like she's close to anyone. And the person that she's closest with is her mom, but it's still not very close to me, even though she says that she's very close. It never really showed that in the story. It never really built that relationship. So even though maybe they have said it or they imply it, it's different when we actually can understand it for ourselves as the reader, to understand that relationship and to kind of see them building this mother-daughter relationship over time, and now it's ripped apart. And there's the conflict in the story, and now there's that urgency. But in this story, I didn't really feel that yet, and maybe that's something that's going to come. So those are my thoughts on The Hazelwood so far. Again, I've read chapters 1 through 18. I was pretty wrong in my prediction video that I made about what I thought the story was going to be about, but it's a lot more interesting, I think, when it comes to the fairy tales, because the fairy tales that are shared so far in this story are great. I don't want to take away from that. It's some of the other things I'm not quite clear yet, and maybe they're going to be revealed in the second half of the book, but I just want to share my thoughts before I finish the book. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.